Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author and storytelling madman Eric Malachite, and today's video was written by Dustin Koski. So be sure to show him some love in the comments as you deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel and ring that bell if you haven't, and check out our new sister channel, Geographics, which talks about dinosaurs, and as it just so happens, the Gobi Desert, which we'll be briefly mentioning in today's video. The Gobi Desert, as it turns out, is full of velociraptor fossils. So if a video on the history and discovery of velociraptors sounds like something you'd be interested in, go ahead and click the link in the description or pinned comment and watch the videos we've already got up there for you. Let's get to it. That which doesn't kill us makes us stronger, according to Friedrich Nietzsche. No country is a better example of this than modern China. Long a colonial punching bag for ascendant empires to its west and east, the 1930s would see it come in for the harshest attacks it ever received from nature in recorded history. Even the current environmental troubles it's experiencing from the encroachment of the Gobi Desert pale in comparison to the problems it had then with flooding. Although they're relatively obscure events now in the Western world, these floods were of tantamount importance to China, and not just in the tragedy they inflicted on those who lost property and loved ones to them. No, they changed the very character of China on a spiritual and national scale, in a way that is still felt strongly around the world today. Let's comb through the ruins to see how. We've all heard the story of Noah and the global flood that allegedly washed everyone but a select few away. Perhaps we've heard some of the hundreds of other variations of this story from cultures that circle the globe. As reported by Scientific American in 2016, it was a group of Chinese researchers who found that it wasn't just a thematically resonant story, in China's case at least. Their study of sediments in the Huanghe, or Yellow River Basin, found that approximately 4,000 years ago, the Yellow River diverted off the Tibetan Plateau through the intentional landslide that had been used to dam the Jishi Gorge, and into the heart of ancient China. For China, there were secular implications in addition to the mythological aspect. The first dynastic ruler of China was Emperor Wu, founder of the Shah dynasty. One of the emperor's alleged signature accomplishments was a massive infrastructure program. His dams were supposedly able to, if not stop the flooding catastrophes, at least to address them to a huge degree. His method was not merely to build obstacles for rivers, but to direct them through digging additional canals, ditches, and other waterways, which relieved pressure on dams and allowed faster drainage of accumulated floodwater. If true, such a monumental achievement certainly would make it understandable that it bought his family line generations of popular legitimacy. To be sure, there is still much about Emperor Wu's legacy of dubious historical legitimacy, such as the claim he emerged from his father Gun's body 3 years after his old man was executed for stealing magical soil from heaven. Still, it's a good lesson in how important improving material conditions for the people is for a leader and their descendants. However successful Emperor Wu's dynasty was in combating the flood problem, in reality, subsequent generations were unquestionably overwhelmed by the challenge. Particularly notable was when decades of particularly intense flooding in the northern Yellow River Basin brought down the Song dynasty in 1127 AD. The floods were estimated to have killed at least 1 million people in all, but eliminated the economic and social systems for millions more. To almost literally rub salt in the wound, the floods also deposited vast quantities of alluvium soil, which is essentially soil sediment. This changed the nutritive value of the soil and made it less conducive to the crops that farmers were used to growing in those regions. Yet the harm that was inflicted on humanity by that era of floods was overshadowed by a disaster just over 2 centuries later. In 1333, the region fed by the Qiang, the modern-day Yangtze or Long River in central China, the Oi rivers in southern China initially experienced a severe drought, and then torrential flood rains that devastated the city of Dadu, which was the capital of the Chinese Empire at the time. This urban disaster alone reportedly killed roughly 400,000 people. There were further disasters shortly after for the afflicted population, such as an earthquake in Kingsai, which was said to have been so severe that it caused the formation of a brand new lake. But no single community could have been said to get it worse than Qiangqi in modern northern China. The string of disasters compromised millions of Chinese immune systems, consequently turning much of the land into an accidental biological laboratory for plagues. In 1334, China lost as many as 5 million people to the plague from Qi. It was events like this that gave rise to the notion, which is currently out of favor, that the bubonic plague, aka the Black Death, originated in China. Oftentimes, the greatest harm that a flood will inflict comes after the waters have drained away. Of all the times that Chinese people were struck by flood disasters, one of the most shameful was in 1642, during a siege that pitted the peasant uprising led by Li Zechong against the Ming Dynasty loyalists of the city of Kaifeng, then capital of China and located on the Yellow River. After 6 months of artillery bombardments failed to break the stalemate, a bold new strategy was adopted. In this case, being bold does not prevent a strategy from also being terribly ill-advised. Accounts vary on who was responsible. Encyclopedia Britannica puts the blame on Li Zechong for diverting the Yellow River into Kaifeng. Meanwhile, the authors of the Jews of Kaifeng, China, History, Culture, and Religion ascribes the decision to destroy the dikes protecting Kaifeng to the desperate provincial governor of Xiaomingheng. Popular YouTuber Jacob Geller asserts that both belligerents put the plan in action independently but simultaneously. Subsequent histories agree with the archaeological record that the primary result was the horrendous flooding of Kaifeng, made all the worse by how its impregnable city walls held the water in place and essentially turned the city into a giant tub of death. Of the approximately 300,000 citizens of Kaifeng before the flood, only a few thousand survived. The very infrastructure of the city was so ruined that it would be 20 years before its grounds were officially resettled, let alone recovered to pre-war state. With such disastrous occurrences there for all of China to see, and quite likely its own fault, it's unsurprising that the Ming Dynasty lasted only 2 more years. For his part, Li Seicheng rose to become known as the Dashing King, a reference to how his reign began in 1644 and ended in 1645. By 1931, China had been enduring most of a century of danger and deprivation, an era now often referred to as the century of humiliation. European powers had dominated the nation for decades, extracting wealth through cheap leases of ports and fighting opium wars to spread chemical dependency through China. While there was an independent Chinese government that called itself the Republic of China, in truth it had been largely run by unelected strongmen. The nominal republic government owed much of its position of power to wealth acquired through collaboration with European governments. What's more, it had been some time since the last truly national flooding disaster. It was one for the ages, too. In 1887, a flood of the Yellow River in the Qinghai province, located roughly in the center of modern China, cost nearly 1 million people their lives. Still, it would be decades before the country experienced its greatest calamity. Indeed, between 1928 and 1930, Chinese provinces were mostly affected by droughts. Numerous reports talked of how areas went entire seasons without a drop of rain. This had a way of taking the mind off flood risks, even for professional infrastructure managers. Dikes, canals, and other forms of river management had been allowed to fall into disrepair among all the political turmoil. In June 1931, after a prolonged period of ominous rain where the rates were reported to be as much as 24 inches in a month, the Yangtze, Yellow, and Oi rivers all flooded. 69,000 square miles were submerged, an area more than twice the size of Australia. The major cities struck by the floods included Nanking, Gaoyu, and Hankou, now known as Wuhan. For months, disastrous collapse continued. On August 31st, for example, the dikes around Lake Gaoyu collapsed, resulting in waves that killed as many as 10,000 people in the city of Gaoyu in one day. By contrast, the deadliest flood in American history, the Johnstown, Pennsylvania flood, killed 2,200 people. As before, much of the greatest loss of life came in the follow-up period. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, and malaria all struck mercilessly in rural and urban areas alike. Huge swaths of farmland were ruined, and once again, silt and clay were deposited in huge quantities. The official figure for the farmland loss was 8.5 million acres, the same amount of farmland California used in 2018. Additionally, and especially tragically in its own way, fled refugees were vulnerable both to violence from organized criminal activity and those outside the flood areas who distrusted refugees in general. The most consistent estimates put the total number of lost lives at 4 million, including disease, famine, and other indirect losses. A further 40 million Chinese people were left homeless. In total, that means roughly 1 in every 10 Chinese people lost their life or home to the flood that year. Christopher Courtney's 2018 book, The Nature of Disaster in China, gives an unusually humanized and detailed account in English of those who experienced the flood in the city of Wuhan. For example, average prices for hotel rooms high enough to have avoided the floodwaters tripled, but the weight of extra guests who had to split costs to stay in those rooms often caused entire waterlogged hotels to collapse. Equally opportunistic were boatsmen, who used their small vehicles called sampans in a manner similar to the famous gondolas of Venice. Less similar to Venice was how many people who couldn't afford their prices used whatever boxes or planks they could get their hands on as their own boats, including doors and coffins. Wuhan was an exceptionally modern city by 1930s standards in China, with enough access to oil and other sources of electric energy that streetlights had made active nightlife practical. The flood almost immediately knocked out electricity for the city. For a while, there was only one consistent source of light at night, and it was a grim one. The petroleum giant Texaco had an oil refinery in Wuhan, and due to a crash, it caught fire and burned brightly for 3 days. Even that was relatively merciful compared to the floating benzene and kerosene barrels that caused fires which spread to residences and businesses. Bear in mind that for cities like Nanjing, these nightmarish flood conditions stretched on for 6 weeks. Wuhan endured it for 4 months. Against this backdrop, all that many people of Wuhan could do was engage in massive local mutual aid programs. At first, police resorted to standing on boxes in an attempt to direct boat traffic, but that was clearly inadequate. Volunteers in a group called the Wuhan Emergency Relief Committee assembled elevated walkways of logs and planks. External emergency relief from the Republic of China national government would be slow in arriving and assisting due to the loss of telephone connections and other communications, as well as disasters across the nation, leaving them swamped to an unusually literal sense. When they did arrive, many of their efforts were arguably counterproductive. Resources were devoted to threatening or summarily executing citizens with machine guns on the accusation that they were looters or communists. Many refugees were forced into pestilential camps, scarcely better than homelessness. The message for many was clear: the poor and working people had to rely on each other rather than the national government. Far from being an overlooked event, the floods of central China drew the eyes of much of the Western world, and with it plenty of much-needed aid. Among those who were vital in spreading that awareness and sympathy were Charles Lindbergh, having become one of the most famous men on Earth with his solo transatlantic flight 4 years earlier, and his wife, co-pilot Anne. After arriving in their state-of-the-art Sirius plane on September 19th, the Lindberghs volunteered for a surveying flight mission wherein ultimately they would survey 8,000 miles, taking photographs that would be invaluable both for apportioning disaster relief supplies and for winning material support from those abroad. Surprisingly, it was often Charles who acted as photographer while Anne handled the flight controls. It was not an easy mission for the Lindberghs. With as many desperate people as there were in the land they were surveying, any time the Lindberghs attempted to land near refugees, starving people threatened to swarm the plane, necessitating Charles to drive people off by firing warning shots with his pistol. The Lindberghs had also not accounted for the rapidity of flood-level rivers and ultimately had to bail out when one of the wings dipped into the rapids. Anne would detail their adventures in her subsequent book, North to the Orient. Many missionary organizations already in China also stepped up to address the disaster. Prominent among them was the Missionary Society of St. Columban, an Irish Catholic association. when the city of Hanyang was struck by the Yellow River flooding that left 60,000 refugees in an area called the Black Hills. More than 740 were given shelter at the St. Columban headquarters. It was not a huge facility, and more than 400 refugees were forced to live in a building that had been intended to house a modest 12 nuns. The mission also brought in inoculation services and provided desperately needed vaccines to as many as 900 people a day. 150 patients were treated for cholera a day. Food rations, drawn desperately thin, were distributed to refugees at a rate of 35 cents worth a week, just enough to prevent many from starving. In response, there was a great explosion of parishioners in the region. Reportedly, there were as many as 70,000 of them by 1933, indicating that pure doctrine is no match for improving people's material conditions and recruiting adherents. In September 1931, Imperial Japan took advantage of the crisis in central China. They staged the Mukden incident, where the 29th Japanese Infantry Regiment faked a bombing of a rail line, blamed China, and fired on its military for it. The Japanese military then invaded Manchuria, the northernmost province of China. The Chinese government was distracted and strained, so Japan was able to annex the province by the time it signed an armistice with China in 1932, putting a land more than twice the size of Texas with roughly 30 million people under Japanese occupation. As part of their prize, the Japanese colonizers spent the next 13 years fighting a guerrilla resistance that was heavily linked to the growing Chinese Communist Party. Speaking of the communists, their spokespeople began heavily blaming the national government for the floods. It was a claim strengthened immensely by the fact there was a lot of truth to it. It was also very ironic coming from communists whose guerrilla fighters were known to commandeer relief supplies and even workers during the recovery period. Still, the idea became well planted in the Chinese popular consciousness. Further aiding communist advocates were the actions of many wealthy landowning Chinese people. With many, if not all of their assets lost, the cost of food and other necessities greatly increased, and their land covered in silt, huge portions of the poor and working class had to sell what little they had. Those in a buying position tended to be the wealthy neighbors who owned property at an elevation safe from the flood or out of the flood zone entirely. After the land had recovered from the flood years later, a lot of the land was sold back at prices that the flood survivors could hardly afford, especially since wages were driven down for laborers across the board. While there were many wealthy people who'd selflessly aided their neighbors, there was no shortage of negative examples to reinforce class resentments. In 1938, the Sino-Japanese War became active again, and once more went badly for China. As Japanese forces approached the strategic city of Zhengzhou, the Nationalist Army under Chiang Kai-shek looked back through history and decided it was time to repeat a historic blunder. On June 4th, the Chinese army commenced destroying dikes along the Yellow River to create a flood which would stop the Japanese advance. This action was kept secret from the people in the path of the floodwaters in hopes of catching the Japanese by surprise. By coincidence, it was once again dikes near Kaifeng that were destroyed for this purpose. The project was marked by failure from square one, considering it actually took 3 tries before the Chinese army was able to break the dikes on June 9th. Additionally, it also ended up weakening their own defenses, even as it slowed the Japanese advance. Its military effectiveness was debatable at best, as the Japanese had the naval capacity to switch to performing amphibious assaults on Chinese positions in response to the flooding. Zhengzhou and Wuhan, the last Japanese objectives of the active war, fell by October 1938, while the Chinese army withdrew into mountainous terrain the Japanese judged unassailable. From a humanitarian perspective, the intentional flood was a clear disaster. Once again, the floods didn't just drown people, they ruined farmland and continued to do so for years after. In 1942 and 1943, the regions which had lost farmland to the flood suffered famines, and would continue to do so until 1947, even after the defeat of Imperial Japan. Some counties in the Henan province lost as much as a quarter of their citizens. In all, as many as 800,000 people were killed by the floods, and 4 million were left homeless. Unsurprisingly, the Chinese government initially denied they had been responsible, but independent investigations only took a few weeks to convince the nationalists it was best to come clean. For many Chinese people, this was the last straw. It was one thing that the 1931 floods had been the result of mismanagement. For the Chinese government to kill hundreds of thousands of its own citizens deliberately in a way that ruined land for years after the war was over, unforgivable. The Chinese Communist Party was well equipped to capitalize on this, leading resettlement and redevelopment efforts in the region after the Japanese withdrew and stoking popular resentment. In essence, Chiang Kai-shek's army command had signed the order for his own government to be drowned. On March 15, 1947, the nationalist government used the Yellow River to harm its own citizens one last time. The Yellow River was fully reverted back to its own route when the last of the dike holes was resealed, which caused the flooding of other Chinese communities, again with no warning. The damage of these was relatively little compared to previous disasters, killing hundreds and displacing hundreds of thousands. But the action was considered unforgivable. By 1949, the capital of China would fall to the People's Republic of China, and Chiang Kai-shek retreated to Taiwan, where his ability to drown people was severely limited. Despite flood disasters playing such a large part in putting the communists in power in China, it did not end with their ascension. In 1954, for example, the Yangtze River was hit by an unprecedented flood disaster which would kill 33,000 people. Still, even the US's CIA, no fans of the communist government, said in classified documents that the regime's flood protocols were working surprisingly well. Chairman Mao had already publicly proposed an immense dam project in 1953, an idea he actually swiped from the nationalist government planning committees from 1932. By 1955, Soviet engineers were drawing up the blueprints for what would become the Three Gorges Dam. The Three Gorges Dam was not a quick or straightforward project. The internal disputes in China, along with ongoing environmental disasters, slowed its development time and again. The results were, at times, catastrophic. In 1975, Typhoon Nina caused 62 dams in China to fail, resulting in 150,000 deaths. Concurrent calamities such as the Cultural Revolution further delayed development. The project did not end until 2012, but along the way, China had finally begun having enormously life-saving success with dam, dike, and levee projects. In 1998, China received its worst flooding disaster in a generation and only lost 4,000 lives. In 2020, another flood-prone year, among other memorable disasters in China, just 219 died from floods and diseases associated with them. While tragic in terms of human lives lost, clearly immense progress has been made in saving Chinese lives and homes from the ravages of floodwaters, though it would surely be distasteful to refer to this progress as a great leap forward. China's major rivers have, through the millennia, earned their nickname China's Sorrow time and again. Whether by the cruel vagaries of nature or the short-sightedness of militaries, whole cities have been lost to them and entire systems of government have been changed by their flooding. While it seems at the moment that China has its flood problems under control, its leadership had better keep a close eye on those rivers in the future. Those rivers can control which way the destiny of the nation will flow. Dustin Koski's other writing can be found on Amazon, and not the one that floods. So check that out, and the link's in the description. I hope you learned something today, and if you dug today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment a famous place you'd like us to cover, subscribe to the channel and ring that bell, check out Geographics by clicking that link in the pinned comment, and share this video with someone who loves learning about the people who made history happen and the places that it happens in. I'm Eric Malachite, and we'll see you next time.